I have examined the financial records as completed by Steve Conrad, our very capable treasurer, and found them to be in perfect order. And if anyone wishes to look at the year-end report, it is available. We did have 2 large expenditures last year, the purchase of the video recording equipment and the Kiger trial presentation expenses. Personally, I feel that these funds were well spent. It was in your newsletter, and we just had a discussion about it. And as we speak, Steve is taping. Our programs will be available. You can get them at either Shaban or Florence library branches to look at. If any of you did not see the Kiger trial reenactment, I don't think we have that one yet, though.
We're trying to get it.
Because we had to have an outside source do that one. But isn't there going to be a presentation of that in History Day?
Yes, there is, and I'm hoping we can get it taped.
But, and we will have time. No, when is History Day exactly?
February 25th.
So we will not meet again before then. So I will encourage you to go, and it's in the newsletter, I believe, information about it. Our program tonight was supposed to be Dr. Eric Jackson, from a history professor at Northern. He sort of backed out on the last minute, but one of our own, Jim Duvall, has graciously volunteered to make a presentation tonight, and I think we might find it more interesting than what we originally had scheduled. So Jim, would you come and speak to us?
Thank you. I think you got, did you get my brochure? Yeah, that's my notes. Is this mine?
Oh, underneath this is mine. Sorry about that.
This is rather impromptu, but it couldn't be that impromptu. It's good to see each one here this evening, and this is not as well prepared as I would like for it to have been, because I didn't get notice of the cancellation until last Friday, and then I called in and left a voicemail, and when she called back, I guess I could use the word she was a little distressed, but we didn't know exactly what to do, so I had been studying along the line for a while now about slavery in Boone County, so we decided we would discuss that some, and possibly some of you all will know enough about it that we'll have some discussion at the end of this. I did have 3 handouts that I'd like to give out, and Lori, could you help me with a few of these 2? And the reason, we'll come to these a little bit later, but I wanted to make sure that we had something to go home with. And so what I've done, there's 2. Sorry to run off on the other seat. Trying to decide what would be best to give them out now or later. But this puts a little more of a personal aspect to the subject. Slavery has always been a very difficult subject. It's not something that was new to America. Actually, the records of earliest history indicate that conquering foes would almost always enslave their opponents. Both biblical and secular history record the civilizations who have enslaved others. What became American slavery actually began in Europe and soon became an important enterprise in the new land of America. African rulers in many cases were willing to sell their conquered enemies. The South became the place of development because of the agriculture there. It was a labor-intensive economy, and so it fit in nicely with their economic plans. There are several sources for information about slavery in Boone County. Most of this information is very accessible to you if you have a computer, but even if you don't, the Boone County Library, Shaven Branch has really lots of information. And we'll be discussing some of the sources for information as we go along. I guess the most famous Boone County slave was Margaret Garner. On January the 28th, 1856, there was a dispatch that was telegraphed to the New York Daily News by the Cincinnati correspondent. And the correspondent said this: "A stampede of slaves from the border counties of Kentucky took place last night. One slave woman, finding escape impossible, cut the throats of her children, killing one instantly and severely wounding 2 others." It goes on to say 6 of the fugitives were apprehended, but 8 are said to have escaped. Now, as further dispatches were sent, and back then they didn't have the telephone and all, it was all by telegraph, the details were changed somewhat because there were some inaccuracies in this first dispatch. But basically, and many of you know that story, James Marshall of Richwood owned 3 of the Garners. Archibald Gaines owned Margaret Garner and her 4 children. Her husband, Simeon Garner Jr., was owned by the Marshalls, and there were a total of 17 slaves who fled to Cincinnati in a large horse-drawn sled. It was over ice-covered roads. They got to the Ohio River, which wasn't nearly as wide as it is now, and it was frozen over, and they were able to get to Cincinnati. Well, the owners obtained a warrant pursuant to the fugitive slave law, and they got friends. They got some U.S. Marshals, and they went after the Garners. These events caused national headlines. The New York papers, all the eastern papers were reporting it. Abolition was becoming a big issue at that time, and so this sort of fueled the flames for that. There have been at least 2 books written. There has been a film made by Oprah concerning the Margaret Garner case. If you want to read more about it, there is a historical case study. We got permission and gave these out in 1999. The Historical Society, it's the Garner Fugitive Slave Case. It was actually written as a PhD thesis. It was put in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. Don Thomas made some extra copies for me. I have several here. If you didn't get one then and would like one, you're welcome to it after we're finished here. The first mention of slavery in any literature that I have seen was in 1789 in what is now Boone County. There is a book out called The Falcon, and it's a narrative of the captivity and adventures of John Tanner. And John Tanner in 1789 was 9 years old, and he lived somewhere down near the Petersburg area. And his father had come here from Virginia. His father was actually a Baptist minister. He had pastored in Virginia, and he came to northern Kentucky. Most of them that came here came via Lexington and then up. But we're not told about those details, but he did come to northern Kentucky along the river. And John Taylor reports on his life. He was actually captured as a 9-year-old child. He was born in 1780, and he was captured by the Indians, and the way it happened was, he says that his father and the Negroes and his older brother were out in a field that they had cleared, and they left him home to help his mother take care of the baby. And I'm not sure how many children they had. He didn't elaborate on that. But he said he got tired there in the cabin, so as he carried the baby around, he began pinching the baby. And the baby started crying. And he asked his mother if he could take the baby outside. Well, his father had said, stay in the cabin. He went outside and the baby quit crying, so he began pinching the baby again. And the baby started crying, and his mother came out and said, well, I think the baby needs fed. So she took the baby back in the cabin, and young John decided that he would go down to a walnut tree, which is over toward the field where his father was working, and his father was standing with a rifle while the Negroes and his older brother were dropping corn. And he got to the walnut tree, put a few walnuts in his hat, and 2 Indians grabbed him, muffled his mouth, carted him up through the woods, up the river, up the Miami River, and they carried him very quickly, took him and drug him, and so forth, finally up to Michigan. And apparently they had some kind of a verbal agreement with an old widow squaw who had lost her husband and lost her child. And she was grieving over both of them, but especially apparently the loss of the child was very recent. And so she was grieving over that. And they took him up there and turned him over to her. And then he began a 30-year residence with the Indians. As far as we know, he came back one time to Kentucky. It's a very difficult book to read because it's got a lot of Indian names in it, but it is an interesting book if you'd like to read it. The only reason I reference it, it's mainly about Indians, and it's not mainly about Boone County, but it starts on the south side of the Ohio River, and it starts in what is now Boone County, actually 9 years before we even became a county. And so there were slaves here at that time. Paul Tanner, who was raised in Boone County and was a descendant of one of the earliest slave-owning families in the county, wrote a short book. It's actually 28 pages long. It's called Slavery in Boone County and Its Aftermath. He wrote the book in 1986. He worked for the Kentucky Revenue Department. He transferred to Frankfort, and he died in 1997. I actually went down to his son's house. His son lives in Anderson County, Kentucky, and I had talked to him a few times on the phone. I went down and got permission for the book to be republished, and then he gave permission for his other works to be published and distributed, just so that there wasn't any profit from anyone else. And his son was very glad for that to happen. He actually gave me several copies of some of his other works. But his book on slavery in Boone County is really the most comprehensive of any study that there's been. It's really loaded with facts. It really has a lot of good information. It is now on the Boone County Public Library website. If you go to the website, over to the left, scroll down, and it's under Genealogy and History. And you can pull it up there and you can read it. You can download it to a computer if you care to. But it is a very valuable study. I really think it needs to be published in a hard copy form, but it hasn't been so far. It would be a small book, but it's an extremely valuable book. The Loder Diary has references to slavery in it. Since this was such short notice, I really didn't have time to go back, and I hadn't read in the Loder Diary for several years now. But back when I was going through it, there were quite a few references to slaves. And basically what Mr. Loader would report is that bounty hunters for slaves were coming through Petersburg, crossing the river into Indiana. There were actually 3 Underground Railroad depots on the Indiana side, across from Boone County. And if they could get there, then quite often they could work them by various circuits on up further north. But he reports of bounty hunters, and he tells where they came from. Some, I remember one of them was from the deep south. It was either Mississippi or Louisiana, that they had come all the way up here looking for an escaped slave. Louisville, Lexington, Owenton, different place, Owen County, different places like that are also reported. Sometimes he will record that they have come back and caught a slave and that they are working their way on back. So he gives those kind of reports to us. Paul Tanner, who is actually a descendant of the patriarch of most Tanners who are in Boone County, Frederick Tanner, is listed in the 1810 Virginia census as having 9 or more slaves, and they classified them by the numbers that they had. And we'll look at the census here of Boone County, I'll refer to that in just a little bit. He purchased 200 acres in the Florence-Burlington Pike area. The 1830 census shows that he owns 7 slaves here in Boone County. And Paul Tanner makes the comment, it's hard for me to believe that where the Florence branch of the public library is, my great, whatever, how far back his grandfather goes, he had slaves working that land at one time. And you know, when you get into this, you realize the personal connection of it. Now, there are those today who try to take the descendants and strap them with their activities back then and say they're responsible today. And when some talk about reparations and things like that, I think that's impossible to do, because there are a lot of things that were done in the past, and if we try to get reparated for everything that was done in the past, everybody would be walking around with their hand out, I think. But we can't do that. But it is sometimes surprising, I guess is a good word. When I first began studying the early history of Boone County, I was terribly surprised that there had been slaves here. I graduated from Boone County High School in 1956. There were 3 African American students there in the high school at that time. And they were all from the Burlington area. They had just closed down Lincoln Grant School in Covington, so they were going to the different county schools. But I didn't realize that there had been that many African Americans here. But Frederick Jackson owned them. He was one of the very early settlers of Boone County. Reverend William Carpenter, who was the first pastor of Hopeful Lutheran Church, came from Virginia in 1813 with slaves. He worked a farm with slaves. Reverend Jacob Krigler, who was Carpenter's successor there at Hopeful, came in 1834. He purchased 128 acres near the church. He brought slaves here from Virginia. He worked that land with slave labor. His wife continued to use the slaves to work the farmland there until her death in 1859. A person that I've become very fond of, who was an early Boone County resident, is Reverend John Taylor. He wrote a book called A History of 10 Baptist Churches, and he came from Virginia, and then he preached in the wilderness there, and then he came to Kentucky, into the Versailles area, Elkhorn Creek area, and then finally up to Boone County in 1795. He came to the Bulletsburg area in 1795. He had inherited 4 slaves from his uncle, And he actually didn't know his uncle had died. There wasn't good communication back then. He left his home and he was going to go visit his uncle on his way to Kentucky. And when he got to where his uncle had lived, he found that his uncle had died and that he was the sole heir of all the property that he had. And it was in 1788. He said, I went to visit my uncle about 60 years old. When I got to the neighborhood, I heard of his death. I also heard of a will where he left in the hands of an executor, and that myself was another, so he was an executor as well. When the will was opened, we found that he had made me his heir. His estate was then worth about $3,000, consisting of land, Negroes, stock of various kinds, household furniture, and several $100s of money. This was about 10 times as much as I'd ever owned before. So John Taylor wasn't very prosperous until that time. He had just married, and he later tells us that he inherited 4 Negroes, and 2 of them were young boys. They came along with him, and then with his young sons, when they left for sales, went to Elkhorn Creek and came up to Boone County. Then his sons were still very young, but they helped along